Hi there, and welcome to the HMUN India 2016 video for the Introduction to the Security Council. My name is Rohan Pidaparti, and I will be the Director of the Security Council this year at HMUN India. Sorry for missing the webinar on Monday for those of you that are looking for it. I ended up being a bit sick and wasn't able to make the webinar, but now my lovely face is here for all of you to see. Just to begin with, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. As I said, my name is Rohan Pidaparti. I'm originally from Richmond, Virginia in the United States, and I'm currently a rising senior at Harvard College studying government. I have a lot of a background in Model UN. I've been doing it since 8th grade, and at Harvard I have staffed conferences in Boston, Lima, Peru, Mexico, Italy, China, and I was at HMUN India last year, again as the director of the Security Council, and I'm thrilled to be returning this year. I have served as the head delegate of HMUN, Harvard's competitive travel Model UN team, and this year I'll be serving as Secretary General of HMUN Latin America, our sister conference in Latin America, as the name implies. So just a little bit about how this video is going to go. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the United Nations Security Council, what the Charter says about the Security Council and what powers it gives, a number of important concepts related to the Security Council, and finally we'll discuss how I like to run the committee. Now I know a big element of the webinar that some of you may have missed is that you could ask questions during the session, and though I understand that's not going to be available during this video, I would like to invite all of you to email me with any of your questions leading up to conference at unsc@hmunindia.org. That's unsc@hmunindia.org. So let's get started. So in order to determine the importance of the history of the United Nations Security Council, it is first important to look at the history of the United Nations. The desire for international government stemmed from the atrocities experienced in World War I, where the international community saw the need for arbitration on a massive scale. Of course, after World War I, the Paris Peace Conference established the League of Nations, and the purpose of this league was to maintain harmony between nations, similar to the purpose of the United Nations as we know it today. Though the League of Nations had a few initial successes and was important in creating certain international structures, the League unfortunately did not have representation for nearly half of the world's population, and most importantly, did not have any participation from some of the world's biggest powers, including the United States, Russia, and Germany. It had a number of failures in the time leading up to World War I, leading up to World War II, including aggressive behavior from Japan and from Germany. After World War II, many in the international community realized that there was an important need for international government to arise to prevent the horrors experienced during World War II. In 1944, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference was held in Washington, D.C. to discuss the structure of a so-called United Nations. At this conference were delegations from the Allied Big Four, which included the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, the U.S., and China. The composition of the United Nations Security Council was a very important issue at this time, as it was important to determine which countries would have the biggest voices when it came to settling international disputes and maintaining peace and security. The first discussion centered around who would be permanent members to the Council. Eventually, the victors of World War II were selected, and these victors included France, the Republic of China, the Soviet Union, the UK, and the United States. At one point, the US attempted to add Brazil as a sixth member, but the Russian and British delegations opposed this move. The next most contentious issue that was discussed at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference proved to be the veto rights of permanent members. It was discussed whether or not the Big Five, as they came to be known, would have veto powers over other countries, whether that veto power could be used in all circumstances or when certain abstentions would need to be made. While the Soviets argued for a complete absolute veto of any situation, the British argued that nations that had a stake in the issues that were being discussed should not be allowed to veto. Later next year, in February, the Yalta Conference was held, and all of the delegations agreed that the Big Five powers could veto any action taken by the Council, but not procedural resolutions. This meant that all of these countries had the right to veto substantive matters, but could not veto procedural matters, meaning that debate must be held on all topics that were introduced, but certain action need not be taken. So the UN officially came into existence on October 24th, 1945, when the UN Charter was ratified by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and by a majority of the other 46 signatories at the time. The first meeting of the United Nations Security Council took place on January 17th, 1946, at a church house in Westminster in London, in the United Kingdom. So with that, the Security Council came into existence and began taking action dealing with the world's most pressing conflicts. During the Cold War and the infancy of the Security Council, the tension between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was very difficult, and the fact that both of those countries were members of the Big Five on the Security Council and had veto power meant that the Security Council really couldn't do a whole lot if it related to the United States or Russia, and the Security Council could only really intervene in unrelated conflicts. The first UN peacekeeping force was established in 1956 to end the Suez Crisis in Egypt. However, these Cold War divisions prevented the Security Council from overseeing these forces and creating further UN military bases around the country in order to allow them to rapidly deal with conflicts as they unfolded. The UN had a couple of successful operations in the Congo. It was involved in some negotiations with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War, as well as certain operations in West New Guinea and Cyprus. The Cyprus operations continues to have a peacekeeping presence and remains to this day one of the United Nations' longest peacekeeping missions. In 1971, the seat on the Big Five and the veto power previously held by the Republic of China, the Communist People's Republic of China, was given that seat, as mainland China became the People's Republic and the Republic of China became Taiwan. Now, this vote greatly shifted the balance of power, as at the time it was the Soviet Union versus the Allies in the West, which included the United States, the then Republic of China, and the UK. However, many saw this as a sign of the US's decreasing influence in the organization. With more gridlock occurring in the 70s and 80s, the UN focused on goals related to economic development, cultural exchange, as well as trying to keep peace and maintain security in areas that were unrelated to the most pressing geopolitical conflicts in the world. And this saw a rise in a budget in non-peacekeeping efforts. Now, after the Cold War ended, without this divisive tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, the UN Security Council was able to radically expand its peacekeeping duties, taking on more missions, not worried about the geopolitical ramifications of their actions as they related to permanent members of the Security Council. And the number of resolutions during the 90s more than doubled, and the peacekeeping budget increased exponentially. The UN had successful missions in El Salvador, Namibia, South Africa, Cambodia, a number of places, and it really was instrumental in increasing the scope and scale of United Nations Security Council operations. However, the Security Council did unfortunately have a number of failures in the 90s as well. The UN mission in Somalia was widely viewed as a failure, really not a successful operation, and was unable to create any sort of lasting peace in the region nor secure economic development or cultural exchange for the people of that country. The United Nations mission in Bosnia, after the fall of the former Yugoslavia, was a thoroughly muddled and unclear operation, and really failed to stop any of the dangerous ethnic cleansing that was going on to the ethnic minorities in Bosnia. In 1994, the United Nations Security Council was widely criticized for failing to act in Rwanda when there was credible information that a genocide was occurring and millions of Rwandan refugees were fleeing to nearby countries. In the late 1990s, the UN began taking a larger role in spearheading international interventions, such as the UN mission in Sierra Leone, helping in the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan, overseen by NATO. The Security Council intervened with peacekeepers in Sudan, in Congo, in Sri Lanka, in a number of issues. However, internal reviews of those actions have found that though the UN did succeed in taking action when necessary, the action taken was not as successful as it could have been, and ended up being an administrative difficulty on the Security Council when it came to overseeing those operations and ensuring that they could be maintained and continue. So now we can talk a little bit about what the Security Council looks like today. It still has the same Big Five permanent members with veto power, who are the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, France, and the People's Republic of China. It also has 10 rotating members who are elected for 2-year terms and represent the other regions of the world. These 10 rotating members include Egypt, Senegal, Angola, Japan, Malaysia, Uruguay, Venezuela, New Zealand, Spain, and Ukraine. One of the issues that is most pressing for the Security Council is whether or not this system of rotating members should be reformed, given that sometimes countries that are very small and have very little power to bring to the table have an important say in operations that really do not concern them, and operations that they're really not well suited to help carry out. Additionally, another big issue has been reform of the veto, as smaller countries tend to argue that this veto power simply allows these larger countries to bully other countries and ensure that their interests are maintained at the cost of international peace and security. Others have argued that the Security Council should be reformed to more accurately reflect the balance of power. People cite the fact that France's position in the global community is very different in 2016 as it was in 1945, and that the state of permanent members should be expanded to consider other international superpowers, including countries like India, Germany, and Brazil. Today, the UN conducts many operations in the Middle East and Africa. Most of the resolutions passed in the last 2 years deal with this region of the world and are largely related to the topics of international security, crimes against humanity, and various civil wars going on in countries as democratic uprisings occur. The modern criticisms of the UN include that it is a puppet of the West, as it only intervenes in countries where countries like the United States and the UK have a compelling interest, that it fails to act in other situations where it's truly necessary, and that this failure to act stems from the fact that there is no real authority. The UN is composed of its members, and if its members are also bound to their national interests and their national legislation, then there's not necessarily anything that compels them to act in the interests of the international community as opposed to acting in the interests of their own sovereign state. And this ties back into, once again, this criticism that the UN is only powerful when the powerful nations within it decide to act. And when those powerful nations are acting, they are not acting in the interests of the United Nations and the international community. They are acting in their own sovereign interests and placing those above all else. Regardless of the criticisms that the United Nations Security Council faces today, it does still meet year-round and is still a very important governing body when it comes to flare-ups in international crises around the world. It is such an important body that each Security Council member nation must have a representative available at the UN headquarters at all times in case an emergency arises and a meeting must be summoned. The Security Council generally meets in a specific room in the United Nations Conference Building in New York City, United States, but it has also held meetings in cities including Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, Panama City in Panama, and Geneva in Switzerland. So in discussing what is and isn't appropriate for the Security Council to take on, it's important to look to the Charter of the United Nations. The Charter of the United Nations lays out the entirety of the mission of the United Nations, and I would encourage you to take a look at it if you have a chance as you're thinking about why the United Nations is an important organization, why it's important to simulate, and what role it has in the modern world, especially for those of you that are thinking about diplomacy and careers in international relations. So Chapter 5 of the United Nations Charter is what principally deals with matters related to the Security Council. Article 23, which is the first article in that chapter, describes the election of members to the Security Council, the fact that each member will only be allowed one representative at the Security Council, as well as the 5 members that will permanently be on the Security Council. It also goes on to detail how the rotating memberships will be elected and regional representation. Next is Article 24, which is very important because it details the functions and powers of the Security Council. Here it outlines the main purpose of the United Nations Security Council, which is to maintain international peace and security. This responsibility is conferred on the Security Council by the United Nations, and so therefore all operations conducted by the Security Council in any part of the world must act in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So that is very important. Even though the Security Council is an autonomous organization and acts as a subset of the UN, it must be in accordance with these purposes and principles of the United Nations that are outlined in the Charter. So Article 27 then goes on to deal with voting. So every member of the Security Council, including the permanent ones, each gets one vote. Procedural matters, these include things like voting on what to debate, speaking order, speaking time, these sort of things, only require 9 affirmative votes from members. You cannot abstain from these matters. There is no veto power on these matters. All it takes is 9 of 15 members agreeing. For non-procedural matters, including the adoption of resolutions, the decisions to take actions, censorship of certain members, anything like that. Any sort of major non-procedural matters require, in addition to 9 affirmative votes, no veto from the permanent members of the Security Council, known as the P5. So it's not just 9 affirmative votes, it is 9 affirmative votes and no veto. Only in non-procedural matters can countries abstain, though it is generally held that countries who are direct participants in a matter should abstain. They often vote yes, no, or if they're a P5 member, can veto in these situations. So next we have Article 29, which deals with the establishment of subsidiary organizations. Often the Security Council, especially when it creates a permanent peacekeeping mission, will set up a new body so that the mission can be carried out and that there's some longevity to the operation, so that not everyone leaves as soon as the basic operation is conducted, and they can be there to examine the aftermath of the issue and ensure that long-term stability can be achieved. So the Article 29 says that the creation of new bodies is okay as long as those new bodies are necessary to the performance of those functions. In Model United Nations, often the best solution that people bring up is simply to create a new body, though that often comes with an administrative burden because it means growing an already pretty bloated organization. So it encourages the delegates, if they are thinking about creating new bodies to resolve the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, ensure that those new organizations are necessary to the performance of the functions of the United Nations Security Council. Later articles deal principally with the Security Council's operations and how it is supposed to make determinations about threats to peace and international security. Article 39 gives the Security Council the authority to determine the existence of any of these threats and make the necessary recommendations. These recommendations can be made to specific countries, or they can be made to other bodies in the UN, such as the larger committees that might be better suited to take action in those situations. Article 41 deals with the use of armed force, and this article states that it can include the interruption of economic relations, which is one of the most common ways that the Security Council takes action these days, which is by sanctioning countries that do not comply with Security Council resolutions. This also can include other forms of interrupting economic relations, communication, and various other forms of non-military activity. Article 42 discusses larger scale operations, including the use of armed forces on land, air, and sea. Now, Article 42 is usually when the Security Council is conducting large-scale operations or authorizing joint missions in a country, or generally getting involved on a much, much larger scale. So I know I just gave you a lot of information there with the charter, and if you read the charter, it has very formal, specific language. I'm not asking you to memorize that or commit it or bring a copy of it to committee, but I just want you to understand how the Security Council works. What are the official powers it has? What is the structure as defined by the charter? Sort of with what intentions was it created? And I want you to think about that as you come up with solutions to the problem at hand. I want to see creative, new, innovative solutions that really go outside the box, but still are within the framework established by the charter. We want to see these new ideas come up within the framework that is established here. And it's an important exercise in thinking like a diplomat and learning how to understand the constraints under which you must operate, but still come up with solutions that ultimately can solve the problem. I think this is one of the great purposes of Model UN as an educational activity. You learn how to think in certain ways and come up with new solutions to old problems. So now we're going to talk about a couple of the important concepts related to how you guys will act in the Security Council, beginning with voting and veto power. When it comes to voting, we will be using the rules as laid out by the Charter. So this means it's 9 votes to pass anything at all, even procedural stuff. Even if we're just voting on a moderated caucus or anything like that, it will still require 9 votes. Even though it's only 15 people, 7 or 8 is not going to be enough to pass. We will still need 9 to pass. However, if this becomes a problem, and 9 is simply too high a bar and nothing gets passed at all and it prevents us from moving forward in committee, then we can discuss reducing that number, amending the rules just for a little bit in the spirit of committee expediency. So in procedural matters, everyone must vote, and that vote must be a yes or a no. If it comes to 9 affirmative votes, we will pass. But in substantive matters, delegates can abstain and that vote will not be counted. However, when I'm taking attendance, if you say that you are present and voting, this means that you cannot abstain on any substantive matters. So think about that carefully, because once you say present and voting for the rest of that day's session, you will not be allowed to abstain, and you might want to reserve the ability to do so later. Now, if a P5 member, one of the permanent members that have veto power, says that they are present and voting, they lose their opportunity to abstain. And so that means if we're voting on something very important, they can only say yes or veto, meaning that their no vote overrides everyone else's yes vote. Even if it's 14 yes votes and 1 no from a P5 member, then that has been vetoed. So I would encourage all members representing the P5 to be cautious about saying that they're present and voting, because it removes the option to abstain later. So dealing with the veto is very important. It's something that the real Security Council often struggles with, when a particular nation consistently vetoes issues. So because in the real Security Council, delegates must get around the issue of the veto, in our Security Council, I want you guys to figure out creative ways to work around the veto as well. I'm not going to question when a delegate chooses to exercise their veto power. They can do so however they wish. But once again, if it seems to be something that is holding committee back in an extreme way and preventing us from moving forward and just seems frivolous action that is not really based in any kind of committee information or the position of that country, the delegate and I will have a discussion and we'll see if we can work something out. But like I said, I do want to see the delegates work around the veto, find ways to get countries to agree with them. Because the Security Council is a double delegate committee, this is a good opportunity to send one of the members of the delegation outside to negotiate with another member of another delegation while the others remain inside and continue speaking and debating. I don't want too many people outside the committee room at any one time, but it's very okay to go outside, have a quick meeting, negotiate in a faster way than you would be able to inside the committee room. And I don't want those negotiations going on too often inside the committee room, because that increases crosstalk, and I want delegates to be listening to other delegates who are speaking. Another important thing to note about voting in the veto is that if neither member of a delegation is present, that is an automatic abstention. So if both of the delegates are outside for a particular topic and voting is going on, because during voting procedure the doors are closed, they may not re-enter, and it is an automatic abstention. Once again, if this is a P5 member and they are not present, then they will be abstaining and they will not have the opportunity to exercise their veto power. In 1950, when the Security Council was discussing a resolution related to the war in Korea, the Russian delegation had stepped outside to discuss something and they went into voting procedure, and because they could not veto, it became an automatic abstention, and a resolution that was decidedly against Russia's interest was allowed to pass. So I would encourage delegates to think critically about how voting is going to affect their ability to push their interests in committee, and especially if you're a P5 member, thinking about how you're going to use the veto, how to get around it, and how to use it appropriately. So another important concept I'd like to talk to you about is the idea of the responsibility to protect. It's often abbreviated as R2P. The responsibility to protect was a global commitment made in 2005 by all United Nations members to prevent genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. It has emerged as a major concept in international law and is rooted in the idea that a nation's sovereignty comes with a responsibility to protect its sovereign populations from crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and the like. It is now the mandate of the United Nations and of the Security Council to support sovereign states in carrying out this responsibility. So this can mean helping them out with all operations necessary and in whatever capacity it seems appropriate to help them carry out this responsibility to protect their citizens. Now, this has also been interpreted as to say that the United Nations Security Council can intervene if the state appears that they are not carrying out this responsibility to protect, or that they do not have the capacity to protect their citizens in the way that this doctrine suggests. This concept is very important for delegates to consider when they're deciding whether or not to intervene internationally, especially because often these kinds of international interventions, whether intentionally or inadvertently, violate the sovereignty of a nation, because an external actor is coming in, deciding what is appropriate for this nation, and taking sometimes pretty drastic action. The Security Council has cited the responsibility to protect as a guideline for interventions in countries like Sudan, Libya, Yemen, Mali, and Syria. The Secretary General regularly produces reports about the responsibility to protect in international situations and relevant crises, how international arrangements and frameworks can be leveraged to greater increase this responsibility to protect. So as it relates to the South China Sea, this question becomes more interesting because the problem is raised of who exactly the people who live in areas like the Spratly Islands and other small territories in the South China Sea, whose responsibility is it to protect those people should they be in danger? As the situation escalates and increasingly becomes a military problem, the people that live in the South China Sea are increasingly in danger and deserve to be protected. Now, that question of protection gets complicated because it is hard to determine what nationality those people are and under whose sovereignty they fall. Are they Chinese? Are they from the Philippines? Are they Vietnamese? And so these questions are important for the delegates to think about if the Security Council is to intervene in this area. Additionally, as the situation grows more militaristic, there's the possibility that this conflict could expand beyond the South China Sea and become a greater problem in Southeast Asia and East Asia. And then what happens? What if one of the governments involved in this territorial dispute begins endangering its own citizens who do not live in the South China Sea or Spratly Islands? It is then also important to discuss the responsibility to protect and whether that is still being met and how that affects whether or not it might be appropriate for the Security Council to intervene in that situation. I know that's a tough question for the delegates to try to deal with, but I do want you guys to think critically about that and think about how any solution for this issue will incorporate the concept of responsibility to protect. As since I mentioned earlier, it is becoming a larger concept in international law, and the Security Council, as a large agent of international governance, must always be acting in accordance with international law, as it must be party to all of the agreements that it creates. So the final concept I thought it'd be appropriate to talk about is basically the mandate of the United Nations Security Council. In a single sentence, the mandate of the Security Council is, as stated in the Charter, to maintain international peace and security. Though that sounds pretty simple, it ends up being much more complicated in action. The language of the Charter is very contentious, and this single line is used as a justification for when it is and is not appropriate for the Security Council to intervene in certain situations. Especially in the modern context, this is particularly difficult because there are a lot of international crises on large scale. We also see a lot of large crises occurring in particular regions, localized in certain parts of the world, even just within the borders of a sovereign country. And it's difficult to determine what exactly constitutes a threat to international security. For example, is a civil war in just one country a threat to international security? Is it something that merits the full involvement of the Security Council? Is it simply a situation where the Security Council should use its authority to reach out to the relevant parties, make certain recommendations, dispatch certain fact-finding investigations? Or is it pressing enough and a large enough threat on a global scale that a full-scale intervention is necessary, including military, economic, and political charges? Additionally, this is complicated by the question of who decides when something is a threat to international peace and security. Especially for the Security Council, the same criticisms apply. It is only the powerful countries that get to decide. The voices of large swaths of the world are ignored, and it's really the P5 that get to decide when something is a threat to international peace and security and when an intervention might be necessary. And this often becomes a split on the Security Council. For example, terrorism in the Middle East has been a large concern for the United States and for the United Kingdom, and it's something they constantly want discussed on the agenda, whereas China is less concerned with some of those matters and is looking eastward to the issues that it would like to see discussed. And so it's important to consider that perspective when deciding when something is it something that the entire international community considers a threat, or is it a threat to the strategic interests of particular countries serving on the Security Council? And so that's something for the delegates to think about as they go about debating and deciding how to tackle a problem. So in the South China Sea, the situation is definitely growing and escalating, especially as more and more military developments get involved. But the question remains for the delegates, is this a threat to international peace and security, or is it a regional problem localized to the South China Sea and just a territorial dispute after all? Do the economic conditions of the Spratly Islands as a major fishing area as well as a major shipping lane for trade make it more of an international threat than just something localized to the South China Sea? Should the Security Council simply be talking to ASEAN and the governments of the countries involved and encouraging mediation between them and trying to help them facilitate discussions that would bring about an end to this issue? Or is it something where the Security Council needs to take direct action, whether they need to get peacekeepers involved or establish a joint operation calling on member nations of the United Nations to join together in order to solve this crisis? The fact that the U.S. and China as permanent members are also very involved in this conflict is important to consider in determining whether this is a threat to international peace and security. As you can see, this is sort of a central theme of dilemmas facing the Security Council, where countries are expected to prioritize the interests of the international community and safeguarding those interests, while at the same time they have issues that are more personally relevant to them that they think are more important and sometimes cannot be ignored when making decisions, when it gets incorporated into the calculus that gets used to reach a conclusion about sensitive topics. So we're nearing the end of the video, and I know that it was a lot of me just talking, and I know that my voice is absolutely lovely, but thank you for sticking through this far, and you'll get to hear plenty more of my voice at conference. So I just want to wrap up with what I consider important in the Security Council. Both when I'm directing and when I'm a delegate, I absolutely love the Security Council. It's my favorite committee. I think it's the most interesting committee, the most complicated committee, and thusly the most exciting committee available on the circuit. It's something I get very passionate about, and I hope that the delegates bring that same amount of passion to the committee with their debate and research and enthusiasm. Participation is very, very important to me. You don't learn anything if you don't participate, and I do believe that Model UN is fundamentally an educational activity. And more importantly, if you don't participate, you're not going to have any fun, because you only have fun when you're participating, getting to know people, talking, getting involved, getting invested in the debate. I will try to call on people as equitably as possible, ensure everyone gets a chance to speak. I will encourage you not to be shy and raise your placard, though that's usually not a problem in Security Council when everyone gets very excited about participating. I want delegates to take this committee seriously, but not too seriously. At HMUN, the philosophy very much centers around diplomacy and model United Nations, and I really do want to ensure that delegates are being diplomatic, even if they're getting very excited and very enthusiastic about debate. There's never an occasion to be disrespectful, to be mean to another delegate, verbally or physically in any kind of capacity, and that is something I will take very, very seriously. I do not want things in my committee getting disrespectful or undiplomatic. Though obviously Model UN is a competitive endeavor, and at the end of the day there are awards, but for me as a director, what is most important is that you are having fun, meeting people, and that you learn something. And so when delegates are undiplomatic and disrespectful, that gets in the way of that purpose that I very much want the delegates to have. So I want you to keep that in mind when you are participating. It's something that's very important to me. I'm really excited about this topic. I think it's a topic that is of increasing relevance internationally. It's going to be exciting to debate this topic as things are going on. We'll be able to begin our committee just as the issue is actually unfolding in the real world when we meet in August. And the delegates will have just as up-to-the-minute information as anyone else discussing these topics. And I'm really excited to see what kind of innovative solutions the delegates bring to the table. I really like delegates who think creatively, who work with other delegates to come up with new solutions that haven't been seen before, because that's one of the great things about Model UN. You're given this opportunity over 4 days to dress up and put on the outfit of a diplomat and come into committee and try to tackle problems that are being addressed by some of the world's smartest people at this time, and you guys have just as much of a shot of coming up with a solution as they do. And I always enjoy being a director because it's amazing for me to see what people as young as you can produce and bring to the table to solve these issues that become incredibly challenging for so many people and affect directly the lives of so many people in parts of the world. But I'm very excited about this topic. As I said, I'm very excited to meet all of you. We'll see you in Hyderabad very, very soon in August. Until then, as I stated earlier at the beginning of this video, feel free to email me with any questions at unsc@hmunindia.org. That's unsc@hmunindia.org. I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible if you have any questions related to things like position papers, the topic areas, how committee is going to operate, any questions you have about HMUN India is your first time, or if you're new to Model UN, I'm happy to help you out there as well. But so just feel free to email me with any questions you have. The HMUN India website and Facebook page are also great resources if you have any questions more broadly related to conference. But I'm very excited to see you all, and I look forward to seeing you in August. All the best.